Two Canadian journalists arrested while covering an ongoing BC pipeline dispute have been released. RCMP say they were enforcing an injunction against protesters in northern BC when they arrested the two, Amber Bracken and Michael Toledano. They were freed 3 days later, but they are due back in court in February.
In a statement released yesterday, BC RCMP Assistant Commissioner Eric Stubbs says police understand the important constitutional role of the media and that the RCMP's relationship with journalists is based on mutual respect and professionalism. For reaction to this, let's bring in Brent Joly, National President of the Canadian Association of Journalists, and Mike D'Souza, Managing Editor of the Narwhal. Thanks to you both for joining us. I want to start with you, Brent, because we spoke just a couple of days ago while this was happening. You've been pushing for these journalists to be released. Now this has happened. Tell us more about the effort to make this happen.
Yeah, well, I would say it's good to be back, but I wish it was under better circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I guess, you know, we've continued to, like you said, we've continued to push. And thankfully, both Michael and Amber have been released. You know, they've agreed to respect the terms of the injunction and respect the peace, which, you know, quite frankly, I would argue was something that they were doing already. So I don't really know why, you know, what exactly that means. A little bit more on the statement from Mr. Stubbs there that you read. Mm-hmm. I kind of have to stop myself from laughing because it's so, you know, so over the top. But I do hope that I am able to talk with him and we can have a good conversation where we can sort of hopefully transfer some of those words into concrete actions.
Mike, you're the managing editor of the Narwhal. Both journalists were working for the Narwhal when they were...
One of them was, yeah.
One of them was, excuse me. Which one?
Yeah. Amber Bracken was on assignment for us.
Okay, and so can you give us an idea of what your communication was or your understanding as all of this was unfolding?
Communication with the RCMP or with the journalists themselves?
Let's do both. RCMP, what did you hear from them?
Conflicting statements. It wasn't clear. I mean, in terms of, you know, the public statements that they've made about whether at what point did the journalists identify themselves. They knew well in advance that these reporters would be there. We told them in advance that our photojournalist who was on assignment there would be there and would be inside the injunction zone. And we know that she had a right to be there. As a journalist, she was acting lawfully and doing her job. They then publicly claimed that journalists who were on site had not identified themselves at the right time, which I'm trying to understand what that means, given that they knew that they were there. You know, we looked at what they submitted to the courts to support the arrests and to support their actions. And they even state that they had been tracking these journalists, that they have a database, and they have added up every interaction that they've had with both Amber and with Michael. So for them to then turn around and say they only identified themselves after we broke down a door with an axe and pointed rifles at them, I mean, I don't know if there's a section in any of the recent court judgments or in the law that says at what point a journalist needs to openly identify that they're a journalist. But Amber, we know, was openly identifying herself as a journalist. She had her equipment. She also had visible ID on her, identifying her as being on assignment as a photojournalist and working for the Narwhal. She was carrying a letter of assignment with her. And I just am baffled and eager to hear more from the RCMP of exactly what happened and why it happened.
Mike, as managing editor, it sounds like you took a lot of precautions early on. You mentioned a letter. She had ID on her to identify that she was, in fact, a journalist. How do you feel being in this position now where you must have been worried for her safety at some points?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as you note, like, we did proactively reach out to the RCMP to work with them as professionals. Whether they return that courtesy, I don't know, but it's one thing if in the middle of a police operation, if someone needs to be moved out of the way, or if you tell a journalist, this is not a safe place, please move, let us do our jobs, and we don't want to be there to obstruct anything. But this is not what happened in this case. As Amber and as Michael were there to document a case involving Indigenous rights, the RCMP did not want images of that to be captured. We still haven't had the chance to publish or review the images. Hopefully, we will in the coming days. But the images of them breaking down a door with an axe and pointing assault rifles at land defenders, at people on their traditional territory, and at journalists. So that's one thing. But the thing that I was worried about most, it's one thing to temporarily detain a journalist, and it's completely going much further to lock them in a jail cell for 3 or 4 days. Is this Canada? Is this a free democracy? Is this how we treat journalists now, to lock them up in harsh conditions, to mistreat them and not free them as they should have been freed? So it is very sad, and I admire the courage, the composure of both Amber and Michael, and I hope that this is not going to happen again. I'm worried, though, that there's much more work we need to do to prevent something like this from happening again.
I want to just read you guys a statement from the RCMP today, because the issue of executing the injunction here is a problem. So RCMP say today orders and injunctions from the Supreme Court of British Columbia are not optional invitations or suggestions for the parties and the police. Instead, they are mandatory directions from the court. Police are not at liberty to choose which law to follow. So, Brent, I want to get your perspective on what this statement says, what the arrests say about the state of freedom of the press in Canada.
Yeah, I find that statement kind of troubling, because what that says to me is it, again, sort of doesn't have a distinction for journalists who are there to observe and report and document and to explain to people the events that are taking place so that they can make informed decisions. To me, that makes it sound like, the journalists are subject to injunctions because they're there to participate in protests, to squat on dirt roads, to throw stones at people, which is completely untrue and unfounded. That's not what journalists have done. And I know, Rashmi, we've talked about this several times about, ensuring journalist behavior. And that's how we look at it when we're talking about, the privileges that journalists have under the Constitution.
Yeah, and to be clear, this injunction that we heard from the RCMP was issued by Coastal Link, right? This is about a pipeline being built on unceded Wet'suwet'en land. And these land defenders, as you described, Mike, are the ones who are looking for some respect on their rights here. But we're talking about the journalists who are there to cover the event of this injunction being enforced by the RCMP between these land defenders on this unceded Wet'suwet'en land. So when we talk about injunctions, Brett, how do these get enforced, and where should the media be when an injunction is being forced? Are you allowed to be embedded when there's something like this unfolding?
Well, I think I'd take caution with using the word embedded, because I think that's very much a word that the RCMP has used to try and spin this issue, to sort of put the onus on journalists to show that they're not committing any actions or not participating. So I'd push back gently against that, because I think journalists are there. They are ultimately, they have to be around the protesters or land defenders in order to hear their stories. What are they doing? What are they, you have to be able to have some context and understand what people are doing to report on it. But from a general perspective, journalists are there. They're not participating in the protests or demonstrations of any kind. And that's the fact that the RCMP really needs to recognize, is that they have a right to be there, and that they're not interfering in the enforcement of the injunction.
Before we let you go, Mike, just want to ask you about next steps. What happens to Amber and Michael going forward? At least Amber, I know you're helping her out in this case.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that we're going to give her time to get home and get settled. We will continue to report on these issues. I don't think I can say much more beyond that yet, but this has not ended. This battle, to defend free press and to defend our ability to tell stories about Indigenous rights, it is going to continue.
Okay, thanks to you both for being here. Brent and Michael, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good night.
Thank you
Thanks.
both.